Greetings all. Congratulations to those who have made it. You have made it through 11 chapters of my course thus far, and now you are on the last one. You are at the last hurdle. So a huge thank you to all who have seen these videos. If you haven't, please like, share, subscribe. These aren't the biggest earners for the channel. Certainly they don't earn any money, nor does this channel earn any money. But, these videos don't really get very many views, and I just appreciate what little gift you leave behind. I digress. Let's dive into it. First, we are going to continue our discussion of the Renaissance with the invention of printing. Johannes Gutenberg of Mainz, 1398-1468, the inventor of movable type. He's the son of a goldsmith. Both crafts are ultimately similar, where coins are stamped with identical words and images impressed on them with, a renewable matrix. The pages of the first printed books were first stamped with ink spread in rows of movable type, slotted into frames from lines of words. Now, to be fair, Gutenberg isn't the one to invent printing technology. He's the one who puts together the movable type and makes printing technology ultimately accessible for those in Europe. But remember, it is the spread of paper that truly made this reasonable, truly made this possible. I digress. By 1455, Gutenberg's workshop had printed multiple copies of the Latin Bible. The printing press ultimately helped export ideas widely. It made censorship virtually impossible. Relatively difficult at first, but harder and harder as time goes on. It helped stabilize languages and create a common linguistic identity. Once a set of pages is made ready, the press may print hundreds of copies in a number of hours, and then the type is reused. So imagine you want to create 1,000 books, you print 1,000 of page 1, and then 1,000 of page 2, and 1,000 of page 3, etc., etc., etc. The stimulus for this, as I previously mentioned, is the widespread availability of paper. Books become much cheaper and easier to use, written communication is more widespread, levels of literacy will lead to a growing demand for books as well. It's a cycle. Literacy goes up, demand for books go up, book production goes up, literacy goes up, yada, yada, yada.
Now we can look at this map, which shows how quickly the technology of printing spread throughout Europe between 1470 and 1600. In what regions were printing presses most heavily concentrated? What factors may have led to their proliferation in the Low Countries, northern Italy, and Central Europe, compared with France, Spain, and England? Why would so many presses have been located along waterways? Now we have the Renaissance ideals and realities. In a few decades, so many men engaged in the study of Plato that a Platonic academy had formed in Florence. Intellectuals such as Marsilio Ficini, 1433-1499, and Giovanni Pico Mirandola, from 1463 to 1494, were patronized by Cosimo de' Medici. Ficino taught that the individual should look primarily to the salvation of his immortal soul, to free it from its mortal body. He translated Plato's work into Latin, making them wildly accessible for the first time.
Renaissance ideals extended and diversified in the latter 15th century through the medium of the printing press. Greek manuscripts from Byzantium, including Homer, Plato, and the Athenian dramatists, could now be mass-produced using Greek grammars and glossaries to facilitate reading of them. In other words, thanks in part to the printing press, we have a resurgence of Greek. Ficino, his disciple Pico, took an exalted view of man's intellectual and artistic capabilities, arguing that man could aspire to union with God through the exercise of his unique talents. So ultimately, as I'm sure you may have guessed, the Renaissance begins in Italy due to its high competition, use of wealth. This leads to sponsorship because eventually the Italians get tired of killing each other with violence, so now they begin to kill each other with art, metaphorically speaking. Don't at me, YouTube. The difficulty in defining what it means to be the Renaissance, or where the Renaissance starts, or when, comes from the fact that it's not universal. Nobody woke up one day and said they are in the Renaissance, right? It is the spread of art, culture, the renewal of Greco Roman ideals, the rediscovery of these works, and the abundance of excess wealth to actually do something with them, as well as the spread of technology, medicine, etc. While you may also think of the Renaissance as a change in military technology, or even as a change in potential social status with a rising middle class, the Renaissance isn't universal. It begins in Italy and will only slowly work its way northward, such that in England, as an example, they kind of skip the Renaissance entirely. They go directly from a medieval world straight into an early modern world after the 16th century. So, what are these ideals then? What are the ideals that we will explore kind of throughout this video, right? Well, I hope you see figures such as Masaccio, Da Vinci, even Machiavelli as the ideal Renaissance men, men who are educated, who are fluent in multiple fields of study, who begin to see the worth of an individual, A, from an intellectual perspective, but B, as service to the state. And we really get the birth of the idea of the state in the Renaissance, though it doesn't come to full fruition until later. But we must move on to, I think, our first Renaissance man of the day, Niccolò Machiavelli.
In 1498, Machiavelli was a prominent official in the government of a Florentine republic, which was set up 4 years earlier when a French invasion led to the expulsion of the Medici family. His duties involved diplomatic missions to other Italian city-states. In Rome, he was fascinated with the attempt by Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, to create a principality in central Italy by subordinating personal ethics to political ends. When the Medici returned to power in 1512, he was imprisoned, tortured, and exiled. He then devoted his energies to articulating a political philosophy for the time.
And oh, what a philosophy that is. The kings of France and Spain both claimed territory in Italy, each claimed to be the rightful champion of the papacy. Surprise, surprise. Both sent invading armies into the peninsula while competing for the allegiance of the various city-states, which were then torn by internal dissension. Niccolò Machiavelli's 1469-1527 writings reflect the unstable political situation of Florence and his wider aspirations for a unified Italy, which was becoming the battle arena where international struggles are fought. Machiavelli is a controversial figure. Some see him as interested only in the acquisition and exercise of power. Others see him as an Italian patriot. Still others see him as a realist who knew what a ruler's good intentions do and what they, more importantly, do not guarantee. Policies will never have good results in any kind of guaranteed form. This is where the misattributed quote, the ends justify the means, comes in, as the phrase never shows up in Machiavelli's The Prince. More on that later. Ultimately, the philosophy he lays out in The Prince, which is arguably his most famous work, argues that rulers need to focus on security and stability in their state, even if this requires immoral actions, deceit, manipulation, use of violence, etc. His advice isn't a idealistic approach. Rather, it's pragmatic, it's realistic. It's the pragmatic pursuit of this rigid adherence to moral principles which may undermine the effective governance. In other words, do not let your own personal moral code get in the way of being a good prince, i.e., defending your state. And ultimately, you will be judged positively by the public, regardless of what moral or even psychological detriments your rule may have.
Well, we must consider that Machiavelli was living in interesting times. The Florentine Republic was at times under the control of either the Borgia or the Medici families. He saw a trend. For a state to survive, a ruler must be prepared to do anything, however repugnant. We have the Prince, the handbook of tyrants. Now, Machiavelli saw the likes of Cesare Borgia as the only hope for revitalizing the spirit of independence among contemporaries to make Italy fit for self-governance. He hoped that contemporaries would expel the French and Spanish forces and restore ancient traditions of liberty and equality. He regarded a period of despotism as necessary toward that end, not as a permanent form of government. Machiavelli wrote on various topics: politics, theater, history. Although he has been vilified for The Prince as being brutally realistic, his discourses on Livy show a more idealistic view of republicanism. We might also consider The Prince as having been written on two levels: written for the edification of the nobility on one hand, and the education of the commons on the other.
Here, to give you an idea of what Machiavelli's dealing with, we have the state of Italy in 1494. This map shows the divisions of Italy on the eve of the French invasion in 94. Contemporary observers often described Italy as being divided amongst five great powers: Milan, Venice, Florence, the Papal States, and the United Kingdoms of Naples and Sicily. Which of these powers seems most capable of expanding their territories? Which neighboring states would be most threatened by such attempts at expansion? Why would Florence and the Papal States so often find themselves in conflict with each other? And how might we, say, apply this very similar state to, say, the warring states in China, or even, say, the warring later German states, or even the warring states period in Japan, the Sengoku Jidai? You're going to see some common macro political themes here. But back to Machiavelli. Machiavelli never abandoned his interest in the arts of the court and wrote poems, plays, and adaptations of classical comedies. We have Ludovico Ariosto, 1474 to 1533. Ariosto undertook diplomatic missions for the Duke of Ferrara and some of Rome's most powerful prelates. His Orlando Furioso retold the heroic exploits celebrated in the French Song of Roland, but without the heroism, and shared the political skepticism common in The Prince. A new Renaissance ideal is born. It promoted the arts of pleasing the princes who could employ clever men and courtiers.
We have Baldassare Castiglione, 1478 to 1529, who wrote the Book of the Courtier, a handbook of etiquette. He taught how to attain the elegant and seemingly effortless skills necessary for advancement in princely courts. He articulated and popularized the set of talents still associated with the Renaissance man, one accomplished in many pursuits, witty, cultured, and stylish. He rejected the misogyny of the humanists by stressing the ways in which court ladies could rise to influence through the graceful exercise of their womanly powers.
Artists in Italy added an important technical ingredient to painting: mastery of a vanishing perspective. In other words, a one-point perspective, which gave the illusion of three-dimensional space. Yes, medieval art no longer looks like it's being drawn by a fourth grader. They would experiment with the effects of light and shade, shaded the anatomy and proportions of the human body. They recaptured symmetry of classical art and placed the human subject at the center of artistic experience. Techniques also influenced some sculptors as well. Artists had to study the techniques of the courtier and the new artistic techniques in order to succeed in winning a patron. They also had to be ready to perform other services. We'll see this especially with Da Vinci. They're going to oversee the building and decoration of palaces, the designing of tableware, furniture, fanciful uniforms for servants and soldiers, and decorating firearms as well as the creation of new siege equipment and many other things. Artists such as Leonardo da Vinci were prized as much for their capacity to invent deadly weapons as for their paintings and sculptures.
Increasing private wealth and the growth of lay patronage created a huge demand for commodities to increase status of those grappling for prestige. Portraiture became popular as princes and merchants sought to glorify their families and compete with their neighbors and rivals.
Well, also, what else are you going to do with the excess wealth? I mean, today we buy fancy cars. Back then they had a painting made. Not really that different, but I digress. We have some new illusions present. For much of the 15th century, the majority of the great painters were Florentines who followed the footsteps of Masaccio. Remember Masaccio? I mentioned him. 1401 to 28. His lasting legacy was the pioneering use of one point perspective and dramatic lighting. Masaccio's most famous successor is Sandro Botticelli. Yes, that Botticelli, 1445 to 1510, who excelled in depicting graceful motion and the sensuous pleasures of nature and is known today for paintings that evoke the classical mythology. Masaccio, in his painting The Trinity, the body of the crucified Christ appears to be thrust forward by the impassive figure of God the Father, while the Virgin's gaze directly engages the viewer. Here we have an example of the impact of his perspective with the Trinity and the Virgin. See the depth? See how it's made possible by observing the rules of one point perspective? Notice how the figure of Christ seems to push forward at the viewer? Trust me, it's much better if you see it on a larger screen or in real life.
Now let's look at Leonardo da Vinci. He was the most adventurous and versatile artist. Born in 1452 and passed away in 1519, he personifies the Renaissance ideal. He was a painter, architect, musician, mathematician, engineer, inventor, and a few other fields. He first gained the patronage of the Medici ruler Lorenzo the Magnificent. He worked for the Sforza dictators of Milan, designing weapons, and later for the French kings. Although primarily known for his presentational art, he utilized many fields of study to render a project. The designs in his notebooks demonstrate his understanding of principles rarely brought together in one mind. Many royal and noble families vied for his expertise, and he became well known in his lifetime. Later individuals attempted to emulate his career.
Now, a side note about Leonardo da Vinci as well. Many people have in recent years accused him as being not as great as we think he is, because he copied other designs, used other people's work, stole from previous Middle Eastern ideas, etc. A. In the Renaissance world of Italy, there is no copyright. B. There's no kind of protection for your ideas, nor the requirement to cite them. And importantly, C. He's doing all of this work in a time crunch with very little training, and almost all of it is self-taught. The fact that he is taking somebody else's ideas and improving on them is not a detriment. It is human engineering. He is attempting to improve on already existing designs. If his employers don't know that he's just borrowing and improving other people's designs, all the better. He gets paid either way. You would do it too if you could get away with it. Don't lie. Enough of defending Da Vinci. Here is the Virgin on the Rocks. It testifies his typical skill, his passion for science and belief in the universe, as well as it being an ordered place. The figures are arranged geometrically, with every stone and plant depicted in accurate detail. Da Vinci's approach to painting was that it should be as the most accurate imitation of nature as possible. He made careful studies of blades of grass, cloud formations, waterfalls, and obtained human corpses for dissection and reconstructed them by drawing the features of human anatomy. He carried this knowledge over to his paintings. The painting here reveals Leonardo's interest in the variety of human faces and expressions, as well as his utilization of natural settings.
Now we'll look at Leonardo's The Last Supper. This displays his keen studies of human psychology. A serene Christ has just announced to his disciples that one of them will betray him. Betrays the emotions of surprise, horror, and guilt on their faces as they gradually perceive the meaning of their master's statement. It implicates the painter's viewers in the dramatic scene, since they dine alongside Christ in the same room. This is The Last Supper. This fresco, done in tempera on the refectory wall of the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, is a testament in both the powers and limitations of Leonardo's artistry. It skillfully employs the techniques of one-point perspective to create the illusion that Jesus and his disciples are actually dining at the monastery's head table. But because Leonardo had not mastered the technique of fresco painting, he applied tempera pigments onto a dry wall that had been coated with a sealing agent. As a result, the painting's colors began to fade just years after its completion. By the middle of the 16th century, it had seriously deteriorated, and large portions of it became invisible. It was the object of a major restoration campaign in the 1990s.
Can you imagine how mad the residents in Santa Maria were after a decade that they paid for this painting, which presumably cost as much as a car today, that this painting just faded out or began to destroy itself? But I digress. The innovations of Florentine artists were widely imitated, and by the end of the 15th century influenced painters in Venice, which among them is Titian, 1490 to 1576. Many of Titian's paintings evoke the luxurious pleasure, loving life of Venice. His aim was to appeal to the senses by painting idealistic landscapes and portraits of the rich and powerful, subordinated form and meaning to color and elegance. In Rome, we have the eminent painter Raphael. Yes, that Ninja Turtle. And to those of you who are thinking we are just mentioning Ninja Turtles, you are correct. He would cultivate a more spiritual and philosophical approach to his subjects. The School of Athens depicts the luxury and differences of Platonic and Aristotelian thought and includes a number of his contemporaries as models. Here's a self-portrait of the artist as a young man. This is a detail from the School of Athens. We already analyzed aspects of Raphael's famous group portrait of the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. Remember way back when we were talking about the Greeks? Yeah, good times. In addition to featuring his own contemporaries as models, including artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo, yes, the other Ninja Turtles, as well as the architect Bramante, Raphael put himself into this picture. Messages does this choice convey? And here's a hint, it's not just vanity.
We have Michelangelo, Sistine Chapel of the Vatican Palace, products of two different periods of the artist's life. We have the frescoes painted on the ceiling from 1508 to 1512, depicting the scenes from the book of Genesis. All the panels in this series, including the creation of Adam, exemplify his commitment to classical artistic principles and affirm the sublimity of creation and the heroic qualities of mankind. But a quarter of a century later, both his style and mood had changed. In the Last Judgment fresco, completed in 1536, Michelangelo substituted a style that emphasized tension and distortion, a humanity racked with fear, guilt, and frailty, and included himself in it, painting a grotesque self-portrait on the flayed flesh of Saint Bartholomew, martyred by being skinned alive. Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564, like Leonardo, a polymath, painter, sculptor, architect, and poet. At the center of all of his work is the male figure.
The creation of Adam. This is one of a series of frescoes Michelangelo painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Venetian Palace in Rome. He executed them over a period of many years under circumstances of extreme physical hardship. It has since become a rather iconic image. So, how might it be said to capture these Renaissance ideals, including the torturing of the artist as he spent many years painting it? Let alone his students, by the way, because this is something that often gets overlooked with Renaissance artists. The students are often the ones doing the outline work and the initial laying of the groundwork, and they'll even block out color. It's the masters who's then kind of come in afterwards and do all the painting. Michelangelo's a little different with that, as he does pretty much all of the painting himself, but for the first time since late antiquity, monumental statues become figures in the round rather than elements incorporated into buildings or featured on tombs. By freeing sculpture from architecture, the Renaissance re-established it as a separate art form. In other words, not just building decoration. Michelangelo regarded sculpture as the most exalted of the arts because it allowed artists to imitate God most fully in recreating human forms. He also endowed sculpted figures with a sense of life, insisting on working in marble.
We have Michelangelo and the Renaissance of sculpture. We finally get to see Donatello, who definitely preceded this from 1386 to 1466, renowned as a sculptor and as a teacher of many of the succeeding artists. The David is the first freestanding nude of the period, yet David is an agile adolescent. Michelangelo's David was executed in 1501 and was a muscular Greek athlete, celebrating the Florentine Republic's resistance to tyrants. The serenity of David no longer is prominent in the works of his later life, when Michelangelo explored the use of anatomical distortion to create emotional intensity. He began to communicate rage, depression, and sorrow. The culmination of this trend is his unfinished Descent from the Cross, a depiction of an old man, himself, grieving over the distorted, slumping body of the dead Christ.
All four Ninja Turtles do make it into this video. The power and vulnerability of the male body. Donatello's David on the left was the first freestanding nude executed since antiquity. It shows the Hebrew leader as an adolescent youth and is a little over 5 feet tall. In contrast, Michelangelo's David here in the center stands 13 feet high and was placed prominently in front of Florence's city hall to proclaim the city's power and humanistic virtues. Michelangelo's Descent from the Cross on the right, which shows Christ's broken body in the arms of the elderly Nicodemus, i.e. himself, was made for Michelangelo's own tomb. Imagine carving your own tomb monument. That's metal. The Gospels describe Nicodemus as a Pharisee who became a follower of Jesus, who, of course, then is present at his death. Why would Michelangelo choose to represent himself as Nicodemus? How does this representation of David and the context in which the figure is displayed compare to that of, say, Donatello's sculpture?
Renaissance architecture was rooted in the classical past. Most buildings constructed were Romanesque. Great architects adapted their building plans from these structures. They derived their influence from an architecture of Vitruvius, who flourished between 60 and 15 BCE, who was a Roman architect and engineer. The governing principles laid out by Vitruvius were popularized by Leon Battista Alberti in his book On the Art of Building, which began to circulate around 1450.
And this is where we near the end of the video with a final discussion on Renaissance architecture before we move on to Renaissance north of the Alps next time. So, your focus for 60 more seconds, please. As Renaissance buildings emphasized geometrical portion reinforced by an interest in Platonic philosophy, which taught that certain mathematical ratios reflect the harmony of the universe. The same artful proportions will be used for St. Peter's Basilica, and these are evident in the aristocratic country houses later designed by Northern Italian architects, as an example, Andrea Palladio, 1508 1580. Let's have a look at a prime example of Renaissance architecture and the Romanesque style. Here is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This 18th century painting shows the massive interior of this Romanesque building. If it wasn't for the perspective provided by these tiny human figures, the human eye would be fooled into thinking it's actually a much smaller space. All right, y'all. Tune in for part 2 and the Renaissance north of the Alps. We'll see you next time.